Here we will draw the deep, perforating cerebral arterial territories. Label the right side of the page as the deep cerebral structures and the left side of the page as the perforating arterial territories. Note that in an attempt to draw the exact vascular territory of each deep structure would be impractical due to the number of structures we would have to account for and the multiplicity of their arterialization. Instead, here we will label only the vascularization of certain landmark structures. Draw the anterior, posterior, and medial lateral axes now, and we will note the superior-inferior variations in arterialization where appropriate in our diagram itself. First, draw the key anatomical landmarks. Indicate the hypothalamus, which lies in the anterior midline. It borders the third ventricle. Next, label the thalamus, which lies above the hypothalamus in midline. Then, anterior to the hypothalamus, draw the head of the caudate, and then the lentiform nucleus, which is the globus pallidus and putamen combined. Sandwiched in between these structures, show the internal capsule and divide it into its central lying genu, and then its anterior and posterior limbs. Now sketch this same arrangement on the arterial side of the page. Next, show that the perforating branches of the middle cerebral artery, which are known as the lenticulostriate arteries, supply the antero-supero-lateral basal ganglia region. They supply the putamen and lateral globus pallidus, superior internal capsule, the body of the caudate, and the superior caudate head. Then show that the anterior cerebral artery perforating branches, including the recurrent artery of Hübner, supply the anterior, inferior, medial basal ganglia region. The anterior inferior head of the caudate, anterior inferior portion of the anterior limb of the internal capsule, and the medial lentiform nucleus. As we can see, there is substantial overlap in the structures that the lenticulostriate and anterior cerebral arterial territories supply. To account for their differences, make a notation that the lenticulostriate arteries supply the superior portion of the overlapping structures, whereas the anterior cerebral arteries supply the inferior portion. Next, show that the perforating branches of the internal carotid artery supply the genu of the internal capsule and the areas that immediately surround it. Then show that the anterior choroidal artery supplies the posterior, inferior, medial basal ganglia region, the lower internal capsule, medial geniculate nucleus and related acoustic radiations, medial globus pallidus, and tail of the caudate. Now show that the anterior communicating artery supplies the anterior hypothalamus and neighboring diencephalic structures. Then show that the posterior communicating artery supplies the posterior hypothalamus, optic chiasm, and mammillary bodies, and also the anterior thalamus via the thalamotuberal artery. Finally, show that many different thalamic arteries supply the remainder of the thalamus. We draw them separately. Next, let's consolidate this information into a single perforating artery, single structure region list so we can remember what we've learned in a practical way. On the left side of the page, label the deep perforating arteries, and on the right side, label the single structure or region. Indicate that the lenticulostriate arteries supply the antero-supero-lateral basal ganglia region. The anterior cerebral artery supplies the antero-infero-medial basal ganglia region. The internal carotid artery supplies the genu of the internal capsule. The anterior communicating artery supplies the anterior hypothalamus. The posterior communicating artery supplies the posterior hypothalamus. The anterior choroidal artery supplies the posterior limb of the internal capsule, and the thalamic arteries supply the thalamus. This concludes our diagram.